The set of Missing in Action, late June of 1984. The film crew were getting ready for another day. In the middle of the set was Chuck Norris, 44 years old, 6-time undefeated middleweight world karate champion, lead actor and fight coordinator on the picture. Chuck just signed to the biggest deal of his career, a 5-movie contract with Canon Films at $1 million per film. Standing across from him was a 23-year-old Belgian named Jean-Claude Van Damme. He had come to America 2 years earlier with $1,000 in his pocket and almost no English. He had slept in his car for weeks. Chuck Norris had taken him in, fed him, employed him as a bouncer at his pub in Long Beach, and put him on the stunt team for his first American film. Their friendship was never going to be the same after this movie. And it all started with Van Damme telling Chuck Norris that point karate would not survive a real street fight. 6 seconds later, he was on the canvas apologizing in French. That part of the story has been told in pieces over the years. The part that has not been told is what Van Damme did to Chuck Norris 3 weeks later in Manila, the thing that ended the friendship for 28 years. The two men would not appear in a frame of film together until 2012. Stay till the end if you want to find out what happened, and make sure you are subscribed. Chuck Norris's teaching philosophy on the set of Missing in Action was the same as in his own studio. Same drills, same corrections, same expectations. No softer version of Chuck Norris for famous people. No softer version of Chuck Norris for young men who had moved into his house. There was one more thing about this movie, and it mattered. Missing in Action was personal. Chuck Norris had lost his brother in Vietnam in 1970. Chuck had described the film in his own autobiography as a memorial. He was making it for his brother. Aaron Norris was on the picture as credited stunt coordinator, and the two of them had built the stunt team around men they trusted and around Jean-Claude Van Damme. Van Damme was born in Brussels on the 18th of October 1960. He had started Shotokan karate at the age of 10, and he had taken up ballet at 16 to improve his balance, and he had been mocked for it at school by other boys who did not understand what it would do for him later. In 1980, at the age of 19, he had won the European Professional Karate Association Middleweight Championship. His full contact record before he retired from competition was reportedly 18 wins and 1 loss. He had arrived in Los Angeles in 1982 with about $1,000 and almost no English. He had slept in his car for several weeks in the Hollywood area, parking in different places each night so that he would not be moved on by the police. He had been introduced to Chuck Norris through their mutual friend Michel Kissy, the Belgian-Moroccan fighter who had been Van Damme's childhood friend since they were boys in Brussels. Chuck Norris had moved both of them into his house. He fed them. He put Van Damme to work as a bouncer at Woody's Wharf. He trained him personally at his Sherman Oaks studio 3 days a week, often before the doors opened to other students for 6 months. Van Damme was good. He was fast. He was flexible in a way that almost nobody in American karate was flexible, because almost nobody in American karate had taken 6 years of ballet alongside their form's work. His roundhouse kick at full extension reached a height that very few men in any room could match. But his weakness was the weakness of a young man who had not yet seen the edges of what he knew. He had grown up in European full-contact kickboxing, where the rules and the ranges and the assumptions were different from American point karate, and he had not yet learned that the difference was a difference of category, not a difference of quality. He had absorbed from his European training and from his reading about Bruce Lee the unspoken belief that European full contact was the real thing, and that American tournament karate was a softer cousin. Bruce Lee had argued something close to this in the 1960s in Los Angeles, and Bruce Lee had earned the right to argue it, because Bruce Lee could back up the opinion with his hands. Jean-Claude Van Damme, at 23, with 18 wins on his European record and 6 months of free housing in Chuck Norris's home, had not yet earned the right to hold the opinion. He held it anyway. On that Thursday morning in late June, the stunt team was rehearsing the hand-to-hand sequence for the prisoner of war camp escape. Braddock, the character Chuck Norris was playing, was supposed to disarm and drop a Vietnamese guard. Chuck was walking the team through the exact movement, a wrist redirect into a low sweep, the kind of move that reads cleanly on camera because it ends with the opponent on the ground in the frame and Chuck still standing. Van Damme was one of the men running the choreography. He had done the move 4 times. He kept adjusting it. Each time he came around on the counter, he was adding a small spinning element of his own, the kind of European kickboxing finishing move he had won championships with, the kind of move that scored in Brussels and Antwerp and Paris, and did not score in Long Beach. Chuck kept correcting him back to the simpler version. The first correction was patient. The second correction was patient. The third correction landed with a little more weight in the voice, and Van Damme's face changed when he heard it. Aaron Norris was standing at the edge of the mats with a clipboard, watching. 2 Filipino stunt extras were sitting on a road case 10 feet away, drinking water out of dented metal cups. Emmett Walsh, the character actor playing Tuck, was visible in the background, walking from the makeup tent toward the catering table with a paper cup of coffee in his hand, not looking at the rehearsal, but well within earshot. A sound assistant was adjusting a boom mic stand 20 feet away on the dirt path that led around the back of the equipment tent. Van Damme stopped the rehearsal. He stepped back from the mat, hands on his hips, breathing through his nose. He said, in his accented English, that the move Chuck was teaching was fine for the camera, but that it would not work on the street. He said it the way Belgian kickboxers from that era said it, without any malice, with the casual confidence of a young European man who genuinely believed he was being helpful. He believed he was contributing. He believed he was being honest in the way that fighters were supposed to be honest with one another. He said the words, and he meant them. "Chuck your karate," he said. "It is good for the points, for the tournaments. But on the street, against a real fighter, it would not work." The air on the compound did the thing it does when a sentence is spoken that cannot be unspoken. The 2 Filipino extras on the road case stopped talking mid-sentence. Aaron Norris's pen paused on the clipboard, the tip resting against the paper without moving. Emmett Walsh, 20 feet away with a paper cup of coffee, turned his head without meaning to, a small involuntary motion that he would not remember making. The sound assistant on the dirt path pretended to keep adjusting the mic stand, and then stopped moving entirely, his hands still resting on the boom, because he had heard what the Belgian kid had just said, and his hands had decided to wait and see what came next. Chuck Norris did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Van Damme for a long beat, the kind of beat that runs 3 or 4 seconds and feels longer to everyone watching, and then he set down the folded production schedule he had been holding. He placed it on the road case next to one of the Filipino extras, and the man moved his hand a fraction to make room for it without taking his eyes off Chuck Norris's face. Chuck looked back at Van Damme. He said 2 words. "Show me," he said. Then he gestured at the canvas with one open hand. "Use whatever you want," he said. "Belgian kickboxing, full contact, street, whatever works for you. Show me." Van Damme settled into a left lead kickboxing stance. The witnesses on the road case noticed, without being able to name what they were noticing, that it was a different stance from the tournament karate stance Chuck had been working with all morning. Wider, hands lower, weight more centered. That stance was itself part of the lesson he was about to learn, though he did not yet know that. He opened with what he was famous for in Europe, a high round kick off the back leg, the one he would later use over and over again in Bloodsport and Kickboxer, the one that had won him the European Professional Karate Association title in 1980 at the age of 19. Tremendous height, beautiful extension, the kind of kick that almost nobody else in the world could throw the way he threw it. The kick was fast, but the kick was also telegraphed in the way that European full-contact kicks from that era were telegraphed, because the rules of European full contact in 1984 rewarded visible, decisive blows. The body learns what it is praised for, and Van Damme's body had been praised for the loaded wind-up that made the kick red on a judging panel. Chuck Norris did not block it. He did not parry it. He stepped inside the arc of the kick. He stepped toward Van Damme, not away, which is the move you make against a high kicker, because the power of a round kick lives at full extension and dies inside the radius. The kick passed behind Chuck's shoulder. It traveled through empty air with no target, and Van Damme's standing leg was suddenly bearing all of his weight on a slightly compromised line, with his hip still rotating through a finish that no longer had anywhere to go. Chuck Norris's right hand came up under Van Damme's extended leg and controlled it at the back of the knee. His left foot swept Van Damme's standing leg in a low sweep, the kind that does not require power so much as timing, because the opponent's own commitment does most of the work. Van Damme went down, not catastrophically, because Chuck was controlling the descent the way he always controlled a descent, but hard enough that the canvas made a flat slapping sound that carried across the compound. Chuck Norris did not pin him. That was the part of the moment that several of the witnesses would remember the longest. He did not put a hand on Van Damme's chest. He did not stand over him. He stepped back 2 paces. He waited. He let the Belgian kid stand up on his own. Total elapsed time from the start of the round kick to Van Damme's shoulder blades touching canvas was 6 seconds. Van Damme sat up on the canvas. His chest was moving fast, not from physical exertion, because the actual exertion had been minimal, but from the adrenaline that arrives in a young fighter's body when it has just been corrected by an older one. He did what 23-year-olds raised in the European martial arts world did when their teacher had dropped them. He spoke in French first because the language his nervous system had been trained in was the language that came out first. "Pardon, maître," he said. Then he caught himself, looked around at the witnesses, and said it again in English. "I am sorry, Chuck. I was wrong. I am sorry." Chuck Norris extended his hand. He helped Van Damme to his feet. He held the hand for one beat longer than a handshake required, the way men sometimes do when they want to mark a moment without speaking it, and then he let go. He said one sentence. "Different fight," he said. "Different rules. You are a good fighter, Jean-Claude. Get up. We have work to do." Across the compound, the Filipino extra on the road case caught M. Emmett Walsh's eye for a moment. Walsh shook his head once, took a sip of his coffee, and kept walking toward the catering table. The sound assistant resumed adjusting the boom mic stand. The other Filipino extra reached for his water cup. The rehearsal continued. What happened in the 3 weeks that followed is the part of the story that the YouTube channels in this niche do not tell. Chuck Norris did not bench Van Damme. He kept him on the stunt team. He kept coaching him. The Filipino crew started referring to Van Damme as Chuck's Belgian, a tag that followed him for the rest of the shoot. Van Damme moved through the next 3 weeks the way young fighters move when they have been corrected by an elder and have decided to absorb the lesson. He arrived on set early. He stayed late. He ran choreography until Aaron Norris told him to stop because the light was gone. He listened to corrections without arguing. He worked. In the evenings, the two of them ate together at the hotel restaurant. Chuck Norris would order for both of them because Van Damme's English on a Filipino menu was still imperfect. Chuck paid the bill at the end of every meal without comment because Van Damme had no money. It was understood between them, the way these things are understood between an older man and a younger man, that the payment was simply the shape of what was happening between them. One evening Aaron Norris sat down with his brother at the hotel bar after Van Damme had gone upstairs. He said that the kid had it. He said it reminded him of someone, though he did not say of whom. Chuck Norris agreed. Years later, Van Damme would say on camera, in interview after interview, "Before the world knew my name, he already believed in me." That belief began on a canvas mat in late June of 1984, and it solidified across 3 weeks of dinners at a hotel restaurant in the Philippines. It was on a Saturday in mid-July 1984 that the thing happened which would change the geometry of everything between them. The production had wrapped for the weekend. The cast and the stunt team had the next day off. The local Filipino crew had been talking all week about a party in Manila. Van Damme had been invited. Chuck Norris had not been told. The party was loud. The air in the club was wet with the heat of bodies and the wet heat of Manila in July, and the music alternated between Tagalog pop and American disco in the kind of cultural collision that defined nightlife in that city in that decade. Van Damme was at the bar with 2 young women. He was 23 years old. He was European and broke and beautiful, and for the first time in his life, he was in a room where people knew who he was, because Chuck Norris had brought him to the Philippines and put him in a film. The cruelty of what happened next was not the cruelty of malice. It was the cruelty of forgetting. He stayed at the party past midnight. He stayed past 2 in the morning. At some point in the early hours, he went home with one of the young women, and he did not return to the production hotel that night. The next morning was a Sunday. There was no call sheet. But Chuck Norris, 2 weeks earlier, had scheduled a private training session with Van Damme for 10 in the morning in the hotel gym. Van Damme had agreed to it. At 9:45, Chuck Norris was already in the hotel gym. He had warmed up. He was going through the kicking drills he had planned to walk Van Damme through. The space across from him on the mat, the space where a second man was supposed to be standing, was empty. The light from the high windows fell on the empty canvas in the same flat way it had fallen on the canvas at the production compound 3 weeks earlier. 10 o'clock came. The space was empty. 10:15, 10:30, 11 o'clock. Chuck Norris finished his own workout. He showered. He went downstairs to the hotel lobby. He sat in a low leather chair by the window with a cup of coffee and a script bound in plastic, and he waited. At 4 in the afternoon, Jean-Claude Van Damme walked through the front doors of the hotel lobby. He was wearing the same shirt he had been wearing the night before. The shirt carried the smell of someone else's perfume, faint but recognizable to anyone who had ever stood close enough to him to know what his own soap smelled like. His hair was uncombed, his eyes were down. He walked across the lobby toward the bank of elevators without stopping, without looking around, without acknowledging anyone in the room. Aaron Norris was sitting on a couch across from Chuck. He saw Van Damme first. He stood up halfway. He said, "Chuck." Chuck Norris did not turn his head. He was looking at the script in his hand. Although he had not turned a page in 20 minutes, he said quietly, "I see him." Van Damme reached the elevators. He pressed the button. He stepped inside when the doors opened. The doors closed behind him. He did not look back. Chuck Norris did not get up. He sat with the coffee in his right hand and the script in his left. And he looked at the script the way a man looks at something he is no longer reading. The Filipino concierge behind the front desk glanced over and then glanced away. A bellboy who had paused near the door with a luggage cart resumed pushing it across the marble floor. Aaron Norris sat back down on the couch. He waited a long moment. Then he asked his brother if he wanted him to go upstairs and talk to Van Damme. Chuck Norris said, "No, I already know what he is." This is the version of the story that Michel Kissy has told for 40 years. Van Damme's oldest friend, the man who had introduced the two of them in Los Angeles in 1982, the man who was present on the set in the Philippines, has given the substance of it in multiple Belgian and French interviews going back decades. The smell of perfume, the empty mat at 10 in the morning, the 4 o'clock walk across the lobby, the single sentence from Chuck Norris on the couch. That is Kissy's account. That is the account that this video rests on. Chuck Norris did not fire Van Damme. He did not pull him off the picture. He honored the work commitment. Van Damme finished the film. He did the stunts he had been hired to do, and he did them well. But something inside the circle had closed. The dinners at the hotel restaurants stopped. Van Damme ate alone after that, or with the Filipino stunt extras, or with the makeup department. He was no longer at the table with Chuck and Aaron. When the production wrapped in October of 1984, and the cast and crew flew back to the United States, Van Damme was no longer welcome at the house in California. The bouncer job at Woody's Wharf, the job that had paid his rent and put food in his stomach for the better part of 2 years, was gone quietly when the production ended. Van Damme understood. He did not call. 4 years later, in 1988, Van Damme broke into stardom with a film called Bloodsport. The film was made for Cannon Films, the same studio that had hosted his first American work on Chuck's set. The deal was brokered by Menahem Golan, the same producer who had given Chuck Norris his 5-picture $1 million contract 4 years earlier. The man who had refused to bench Van Damme on Missing in Action had, without intending to, built the doors that Van Damme would later walk through. Chuck Norris and Jean-Claude Van Damme did not appear in a frame of film together for the next 28 years. They did not work together. They did not appear on the same red carpet. Both of them moved through the action movie industry in Los Angeles for nearly 3 decades, and neither shared a set with the other. In 2012, they were both cast in The Expendables 2. The film brought together almost every major action star of the previous 40 years. And even in that picture, they did not share a single shot. They appear in scenes that cut between them. They are never in the same physical space at the same time on camera. The two men who had eaten dinner together every night for 3 weeks at a hotel restaurant in the Philippines in 1984 did not stand on the same piece of floor in front of a camera for 28 years. In the spring of 2026, after Chuck Norris's death, Jean-Claude Van Damme posted on social media a single sentence about the man who had taken him in when he had nothing. Before the world knew my name, he wrote, "He already believed in me." That is a verified quote. It is the line that closes the circle that opened on a canvas mat in the Philippines 42 years earlier. There is a lesson in the pin, and there is a lesson in the betrayal, and the two lessons are not the same lesson. The pin taught Jean-Claude Van Damme in 6 seconds on a canvas mat the difference between a man who has the rules of one game and a man who has the rules of a different game. European full contact and American point karate were not better or worse than one another. They were different games with different ranges and different assumptions. And the cost of confusing the two of them was paid in a slow sweep and a flat slap of canvas. That lesson Van Damme absorbed. He spoke about it on camera for the rest of his life. The other lesson he did not absorb in time. The people who feed you when you have nothing, who house you when you are sleeping in your car, who put you in your first film and teach you a tomorrow before the studio opens are not interchangeable with the rest of the world. The cost of forgetting that distinction can run 28 years. It can run the rest of your life if the man you forget dies before you can repair the thing you broke. The production compound at Subic Bay is gone now. The base was returned to Philippine sovereignty in 1992, the buildings around the equipment tent have been demolished or repurposed. But for 6 seconds in late June of 1984, those mats held a question and an answer between two men, and 3 weeks later, in a Manila hotel lobby on a Sunday afternoon, the same two men passed each other without speaking, and the silence between them lasted 28 years. Thank you for watching, and make sure you are subscribed to catch the next Chuck Norris story.